Hey DZone, we're here at All Things Open Day 2 in Raleigh here, and I'm here with Jeff Luszcz. I'm from Palamida. He's the founder and CTO. Very interesting background. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're coming from and
Sure.
what you guys do?
Sure. Thanks for having us today. My name is Jeff Luszcz. I'm the founder of Palamida. Started it back in 2003. We're based in San Francisco, and I started the company based on my experiences working for both large companies and small companies. I spent 6 years working at NASA Ames doing scientific software. Back then, that was when open source was first coming into companies and the government. We actually got our experience there because the company we were using to give us our compiler stopped giving us free compilers. So we said that was Sun at the time.
Sun, okay.
So they stopped shipping a compiler with Solaris, and we had to scramble because they wanted something like, I don't know, $3,000 for a compiler. That was our 10-year software budget. And what we had to do is say, is there a free compiler out there, or is a low-cost compiler? And this is when GCC was getting a lot of press. But our big concern was, is there something, do we have to worry about with the GPL license? The GCC compiler was under the GPL license. The runtime libraries were under some similar license, and we said, is this going to affect the code that we're writing for the government? Is this going to affect our research? And that was my first experience really with open source.
And GPL is fairly restrictive in the sense that you have to put anything you add, you have to put back into it, right?
So yeah, in the sense that some people will call that a free license, some people call it a restrictive license, copyleft, etc. But basically what it says is along the lines of, we want all code to be open. We want all code to be free. So if you use this library or this license under certain circumstances, you write something and you can link it, compile it with this other code, the whole thing needs to be given away to the people who you're distributing your product to.
I'd imagine for like a government context or NASA context, that could be particularly funny or nerve-wracking.
It was worrisome at the time. It was new to the company. It was new to the organization. We wanted to make sure that we were not going to be messing this up. We're being trusted to do the right thing. We did the research, and in our experience, it seemed to be lots of other organizations were using it. It wasn't affecting the output in the way that people were worried about at the time, and that's where we moved to that. And that was my first experience really using open source. We also were starting to bring in other languages like TickleTK at the time, which was good for us because it was a cross-platform development language, much like Java is now, which had allowed us to support Macintosh, Windows, Unix at the time, which was very important because we had many environments we had to support with our kind of internal customers. So that was my experience with licensing, experience with open source. Did that for about 6 years. And then the first .com boom came along. And I was like, it's probably time to join the .com boom. Let's not miss out on this thing. And so I got a job in San Francisco at a small startup. And moving from an organization that had thousands of people to an organization that had 60 people, many things were the same, many things were different. One of the things that was kind of the same is no one really understood open source licensing. We used lots of open source. Everybody uses lots of open source, but nobody really ever gets sat down and says, here's the policy, here's what we want to use, here's how we want to respect the community.
So is it more like, it was like, what happens here with use, but the startup was like, let's just do it.
Let's just do it, ship it. At startups, at software companies, we want to ship. And people will build in maybe security, maybe they'll build in licensing, but most of the time what I see is people want to ship. I call it shipitis. We have to ship. Like, we have to make our deadline no matter what.
The faster you ship, in theory.
Yes, right? Yes. Ship. We'll fix it later. As they say in the movies, we'll fix it in post-production.
Yes.
So we'll fix it in post-production, but you can't fix security in post-production. You can't fix licensing problems really in post-production. If you shipped 1 million hardware devices and you can't remotely update it, you have a problem. And so I was working at this startup, and even with 65 people, half being developers, we were finding week after week issues because of licensing. Somebody checked in something that was under GPL license. Wait, we can't do this.
So was this your job partly?
I was doing a lot of mentoring. I was doing a lot of security reviews. It's kind of just in general, just poking around the environment.
You just ran into it over and
Ran into it. I think because of my experience previously, I had some licensing experience. I'm probably one of the only people at the organization who even knew what an open source license was, just randomly. And I said, we can't use this. And the big confusion was everybody thought it was free. They heard the term free software. They heard the term open source. They thought they were saving the company money, which they were, but they weren't aware of the obligations. And this is something we're not trained in university. We're not trained when we join companies. There's no periodic, let's go sit down and talk about open source. Let's go talk about security. And it's changing these days, but even still, I think it's the most common thing that people try to bolt on security. They try to bolt on open source compliance after the fact, after they have a problem.
Right. Even the concept of auditing is sort of an after the fact.
Exactly. Auditing is an after the fact action. If you wanted to build it in, build it into your CI process, build it into your onboarding documentation. Don't do a once a year audit to say, where are we? Because by that time you've already been shipping it, or you have a huge architectural problem. So So what do we, my experience there was we would sit down everybody in the conference room and say, don't use this, we're a commercial company, we can't use the GPL. If you're pulling in commercial libraries, we have to pay for them. We can't use evaluation keys and things like that, which is, my experience is that's what's happening a lot in large organizations. People think they're doing the right thing. They're not trying to be malicious. They're not trying to steal anything. They just think, hey, I fixed the problem.
Right, and also I don't have to put in some sort of like paperwork to request to my,
Exactly, I don't need to get an NDA, I don't need to get a check, but they're not aware of what the GPL means. There's a lot of folklore, and one of the things that one of our jobs here is with our training is to try to remove a lot of the folklore around open source licensing.
And the folklore is the like super free against the man, that kind of stuff?
Well, the folklore is more like, oh, I heard if you don't do this, you can't get in trouble. If you don't change something, you don't have to worry about the license, or if you compile it this way. And I almost don't want to repeat the folklore because you don't want to spread the folklore. But if you go take your developers, and I always say this, your top 10% developers probably get it. Your probably bottom 10% probably don't care, won't ever care. But the folks in the middle who are doing the everyday development, those are the people who are going out to the internet and getting a library. They're getting a chunk of code. They're reading an O'Reilly book or something like that and pulling in a bunch of software from there. They're the folks who need to understand what the licensing says. They need to understand how it affects your bottom line, how it affects your final intellectual property of your product. And those are the people who are not getting onboarded. Those are the people who are not being told, we prefer MIT, Apache 2.0, BSD licenses, or hey, we're Linux folks. We need to use the GPL. We have to use GPL 2, not GPL 3, because we're building open source drivers. Those are the types of conversations that the whole industry needs to have.
So is this mainly a training issue, or is it training plus a workflow issue?
I think it's, as always, you need to trust and verify. So first thing we need to do is stem the bleeding. We need to make sure that every developer is trained, onboarded, gets a periodic thing once a year. Here's our policy, our current policy. Here's what we like. Here's what we don't like. Here's how you can make requests, etc. So that's an important thing, just to make sure that every developer understands it. You also need to verify. We have a scanning solution. So Palamida has a product that basically allows you to scan your source code, scan your binaries, scan your images and icons, and say, where did this come from?
How does it know that, by the way? Is it just
we have a huge database. We have signatures. We have billions and billions of files that we've spidered from the internet. We've hashed these down to signatures. We also have other heuristics that even without signatures can help identify commercial code, open source code, things that are licensed under various licenses, even if we've never seen them before. So you trust your developers are going to be doing the right thing. We also understand that human nature being what it is, fast development cycles being what they are, things are going to slip in. Maybe it's coming from a partner. Maybe it's coming in from using some of these repository managers, which is a piece of software that build time goes out, pulls down open source from the internet and puts it into your product. Like Nexus, like Node Package Manager, like NuGet. Those things, they're great. They really make our job easy in some ways, but they also bring in hundreds of open source libraries that very rarely make it onto people's final bill of materials.
Right, because you type like apt-get and then that's it.
And it pulls in dependencies, it pulls in the original library. It's wonderful, but you need to know the side effects, as with everything. So my experience then was working at a small startup. So this is something that is a problem from the industry. It was also at the same time that SCO versus IBM was in the news. Linksys with Cisco was in the news. So people, in my opinion, were very mindful about licensing at the time, especially in the big companies. And then that was the end of the dot-com boom, and I found myself in the right place at the right time. Was able to start Palamida back in 2003, and we've been doing that ever since.
Oh, that's a while ago, yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. And so, you're talking about two things here so far: is the open source licensing issue,
yes,
and then also the security issue.
Yes.
Are those the two major areas?
Those are the two major points. They're almost side effects of knowing what you're shipping. So we very often get brought in because of licensing. Companies want to make sure that they're respecting the open source world. They want to make sure that they're not going to be in a situation where they need to open source something that they want to keep proprietary, or they don't want to get sued because they're shipping somebody else's commercial library without paying for it, their fonts, etc. And it really comes down to what are you shipping. So we'll ask companies, what do you think you have? We'll ask, it's called a disclosure sheet. And they will tell us maybe 10 things, 20 things, 30 things. That's a good company. A couple dozen items. We're going to come in with our software and our people, and we're going to add another zero, sometimes another 2 zeros to that. So if you tell us you have 10 things, we're going to find 100. So we sometimes might find 1,000 libraries.
Right, yeah. Orders of magnitude, right?
Exactly.
So just in terms of who knows these kinds of things, so you're talking to like a CTO level person, or like?
So we'll very often come in, brought into VP of Engineering, project manager, CTO, etc., and they're going to say we don't use open source. This is all homegrown. That's almost word for word what we hear almost on every deal that we do. These are people that are supposed to be in their best behavior. They're trying to do a baseline audit, or they're about to be bought or sell themselves, and they need to know everything that they're shipping. And they get this list, and the list is always anemic. It's always old, or it was just scrambled and done last week. And we come in and we're going to 10x this, 100x this. And the side effect of that is nobody was being mindful when they picked these libraries. So the licensing is all screwed up. The licensing is GPL. It's code with no licenses. It's commercial code that isn't being paid for. It's things that have restrictions on use. So not for use in airplanes, not for use in power plants.
Right.
And these are people who are building airplanes. These are people who are building power plants. So they have to do what we call a remediation step then, which is look at this list and say, what can't we ship? What is not respecting? That can be very expensive.
Yeah.
It can cause stop shipment.
Right.
It can cause people are always worried about being sued, and that is definitely a possibility. But a lot of it, what is just why spend money fixing something you should have just done right the first time?
Or if it's like not for use in aviation, but you're shipping it in a Boeing aircraft.
That could be a liability issue.
Yeah, exactly.
So if something says don't ship it, and then plane crashes, or there's a lawsuit about whatever. You might be somebody who's seen as, well, you weren't being mindful when you built the software. You just were not thinking about the problem space.
So I guess to me, the fundamental irreducible issue is that the whole point of a library is that you're not actually doing that work.
Yeah.
So you don't want that much visibility into the inner workings of it.
Yep.
But then in order to know the relevant piece of the inner workings, you have to look at metadata rather than
Exactly.
content. And the developer doesn't want to actually worry about the metadata side of it, right?
Yes.
So is this something that you're saying the developers should have in mind, or is it something that they should not worry about, or the PM should? Or?
My opinion is every developer should know what licensing is about. They should have a short list of licenses that are kind of acceptable to your organization. They should know where to go if they can't find a good library with the acceptable licenses and they need to go out of bounds. How do I escalate that question? How do I escalate that process?
It's so tempting to just circumvent.
Exactly, and that's exactly what people do. And then that's when we come to shipment time or merger and acquisition time or whatever. It's too late. And we have to unwind. Just like people are unwinding mortgages now, we have to unwind these products and say 25% of this has unacceptable licenses. As a commercial company, we can't use this, and this. We have to delete those and start all over again.
So this is like licensing debt or like security debt that you're building up without even noticing.
Exactly.
Whereas something like a pure technical debt, you probably have some awareness that you're making these kinds of decisions. But in the case you're talking about,
everyone is completely surprised. Yeah. I can't tell you how many deals that we do, how many we come in and we do professional services around this, and they say, we swear this is all homegrown. And often if we hear somebody say we have no open source, it's all homegrown, those are going to be the worst deals, the most complicated, dirty, nasty, full of licenses that they shouldn't be there deals. Mostly because what it is, management is completely unaware of what's going on in the development world. And so if management doesn't think this is an issue, they're not going to require training, they're not going to require enforcement, they're not going to require scanning or anything like that. And that's one of the things that we have to change, is make sure that everybody understands about 50% of your product is open source.
Right.
And if you don't have that awareness right now, you're building up this technical debt that's going to cost you a lot. Pay now, pay later.
So is this is this like a policy level, or is this actually something you think needs to enter into the education, into schools? Because security, for example, I know that's an issue where we're starting to try to introduce that earlier in the education. But
I think it's always amazing. Somebody shows up at work the first day. Okay, what do we make them do? We make them sign an NDA. We make them sign a patent and inventions agreement. We make them sign other things around ethics agreements and things like that. We then give them source code management keys, and we say, go build the product. And they've arrived from university with no training on contracts, no training on security, no training on privacy, no training on open source, no training on intellectual property, trademarks, and all that. And first thing we do is say, here's the keys to the kingdom. Please start checking in your code and other people's code. And we shouldn't be surprised that we're getting trademark issues, we're getting copyright issues, we're getting licensing issues, we're getting security issues. Just we haven't trained it. We're basically making computer scientists, but we're not making software engineers.
Like people are going to make the libraries, but that's not the same as the people who are going to use them. So
Correct.
It's like, I took a cryptography course. Well, that's great. You can use the Hellman, but that doesn't mean you can use this library.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this leads to security issues as well. So we talked about how it obviously leads to the intellectual property, the licensing issues where I have 300 libraries. I've never paid attention to them. I never looked at them when I downloaded them. I saw that it was the right XML library, the right crypto library to solve the problem I had, but I didn't know if it was appropriate for my company to sell or to ship. And so I'm going to end up with the side effect of a licensing problem. I'm also going to have a side effect of a security problem. Many of these libraries never get looked at again. They get brought in 5 years ago. They get brought in 10 years ago. We saw this recently with OpenSSL and Heartbleed. Is people checked in OpenSSL. They said, great, I've solved my cryptography problem. Let's go. And then the Heartbleed bug was discovered. And
who knows how long it had been exploited?
How long has it been exploited? But it took so long for people to even find out where it was in their company. Every CEO said, hey, to the VP of engineering, get that report on my desk by tomorrow morning. Where are we using OpenSSL? Where are we shipping it? No one was able to do that. In the entire world, no one got an accurate listing of OpenSSL.
Tell me how your software notices
sure,
that.
Sure.
Take OpenSSL as an example. Like you run your auditing software and it does what?
Sure. So we have a couple techniques. We have about 14, 15 techniques for discovering open source. For something like OpenSSL, we're going to do a couple things. If you have it in source code form, we're going to identify either exact matches to the source files. So we'll use a hashing algorithm and say, that sure looks like OpenSSL or zlib or whatever the library may be. We'll also allow you to do what we call source code fingerprinting. So even if you don't have an exact match to that source code file,
you
pasted a bunch of stuff in, we can say, this sure looks like OpenSSL, and it looks like this particular version.
So what is that like? Just like dipping two different code bases?
We've gone out and we've made an algorithm that allows us to do that at scale. So we have billions and billions of files that we've pulled in, we've hashed them in a certain way, and then we have a very fast algorithm for doing a massive multi-pattern search. So when we're in the field, when our product is running, we'll look at what we call a snippet of code, basically a subline of code, and say, where have we seen this before? And also apply some other metrics. Is this super common? Does this look like code that's generated? It's something that's not very unique, maybe what's called noise. Let's try to suppress those, and let's try to find the things that are very unique, only come from certain versions, only come from certain products, and bubble that up. We call that code rank. It's basically a way of saying, let's look at the most likely cut and pastes before we look at the likely generated code. And then we also look inside of binaries. So for something like OpenSSL, one of the hard things for people is, well, they can go through and they can do a quick grep or a file search and say, go find me OpenSSL directories. There's OpenSSL, we have it. What they miss is when it's buried inside of other applications, other libraries, either in source or binary form. And especially in the binary form, you might have a DLL or an SO, and you grep for OpenSSL, you might not see it. Our technology allows us to go in there, and we're able to identify certain patterns for these libraries. And
so do you know like the most commonly binary strings that are rendered or that are compiled?
That's correct. That's correct. So we have many ways of doing that. That's one of the easiest ways to find the things that have not been kind of hidden in any way. We have some other techniques for finding things that have been modified and kind of hidden. So, and this is a great way, and it's very eye-opening for people, because first off they say, oh, we only have one copy of OpenSSL and we fixed it. They're probably going to have 4 or 5. If you're doing work at scale, and it's coming from your software supply chain, it's coming from your commercial vendors, it's very common for commercial vendors to give you a blob. Here's my DLL, here's my SO, and you just track it as a single line item. You say code from company foo, and it probably has 50 to 500 open source libraries compiled into it.
Right.
Many of which have security issues. Many have been, we still find OpenSSL in blobs that are being shipped today.
Right.
That is
still
affected by Heartbleed.
Yeah.
So here it is in 2015.
Like interesting, like information theoretic stuff that you're doing. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. And I would say the biggest thing is companies are still in this world of getting their initial bill of materials. So what are we shipping? What are 5 things that are wrong with our vendor's code? Let's try to get to that level. Because what we're seeing is people only have about 2% awareness of the open source they're using. That's a sign that there's still a long way to go.
And again, in terms of number of libraries, so they say like we used to, but actually they're using 100 different libraries.
Exactly. And this is surprising to everybody in the chain.
Does it vary by platform?
If it's small, if you're an iPhone app, it's going to be different than if you're a large Java app. But anytime repository managers get involved, anytime multiple teams get involved, or you have like a embedded Linux system, you suddenly should be expecting hundreds, if not thousands, of third-party dependencies, and companies are just nowhere near tracking anywhere.
So that would probably, I would assume, vary with age. Like the older stuff is more likely to just have tons and tons and tons of even older open source libraries in there.
Yeah. So very often we'll see a platform, somebody has pickled it, they put it in a container or a VM, and it's 5 years old. And we'll look and we'll say, no library here is any newer than 5 years old. There's a problem here. You have Heartbleed, you have zlib 113, you have this, you have a Tomcat problem, and that's also something common that we see, especially in enterprises, where they build something for internal use. They pickle it into a VM, gets put someplace, and this gets run. And when we get asked to look at it, we say, you can spend a lot of time and energy kind of auditing this whole thing, but nothing here is newer than 5 years old. Nobody's run update on your operating system. Nobody's looked at it.
Because it might break, right?
It might break, exactly. So that's another issue. So people are building products, building libraries that have lots of unknown open source in it, lots of unknown commercial code. they're also building enterprise systems, pickling it and putting them in virtual machines and just letting it sit there. And that's another type of analysis that companies are starting to do these days.
I know the joke that I heard in one of the keynotes was, so you release something and then you quit the company.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to really
Exactly.
System at this point.
Exactly.
It's just, too dangerous.
Exactly.
So there's that pressure, right? So this is sort of like the opposite of the release really fast pressure. It's the don't touch it because it's working pressure.
Exactly. People want to build stuff, they don't want to maintain things.
Yeah.
So that's one of the problems that I think we have in our industry is we love building new stuff, we love shipping new products, we love shipping new versions. There's no glory in some ways of keeping a product up and running, keeping
like
a product secure. Exactly.
Like that, yeah.
And we need to change that conversation. I think that we're starting to see this where we have large e-stores who say we've never had a day of drop of business. We've never been down for more than a millisecond. That's good to see. And I think we need to get more of that attention to other aspects of the world. I think part of it in some ways is there's no money in it, there's no glory in it. So if your product's down for half a day, it's not dealing with millions of dollars. An email goes out saying, sorry about the delay, we'll do it better next time. I am seeing security being one of the drivers here. So being downtime, people want to minimize it, but it hasn't been one of those things that really has driven paying attention to maintenance, paying attention to keeping upgrades.
And you can kind of overcome that by just scaling horizontally.
Exactly. Put stuff up and etc. But with the security issues, it used to be that once a year somebody would be hacked, it would be front page news. Now it's everybody's being hacked all the time. And
those databases are crazy. You look at it and how is the spreadsheet just keeps getting bigger.
Exactly. So we're starting to see people more baking that into the development process. We need to be secure. We need to understand how we can bring a system down, bring it up very quickly after doing a quick patch. You have people ready to do that at a moment's notice. That's starting to become more of the new idea. I think it's still probably 1 or 2% of the companies that are out there. But I see that being baked in more, and we need to just encourage that.
So that's stuff that you used to always have to do in like embedded systems, right? Or like an atomic update. Right? But if you're just using your package manager, that's not true, right? It takes like 12 seconds or 2 minutes, but in the meantime,
what's going on? Exactly. We still need to build security in. I think it's still the classic case that security is bolted on at the end.
So there's like an essential kind of difficulty here, I guess, which is that like an exploit is something that some other person is purposely injecting, right?
Yes,
Whereas something like a license is just you didn't pay attention to it.
Exactly.
So there's always going to be some kind of like after effect examination. So,
exactly.
So how much can you push up front? It always feels like there's...
I think the big thing for our particular world, which is saying don't use open source libraries that are ancient and have known vulnerabilities. Part of that is just doing continuous monitoring. And that's what our software helps you do, which is let's build a bill of materials. First off, you're going to get rid of 10 or 20% of your code base that you shouldn't be using, either because of licensing, it's dead code, people have tons of dead code, as well as old vulnerabilities. Let's get rid of these things. Okay? And then that's what we call the get clean process. And then the idea is stay clean, which is just do continuous monitoring. Hey, the next Heartbleed has been found. Right? You don't have your CEO or your CTO literally grepping code right next to the developers trying to figure out what's going on.
Right.
Get an alert. You figure out what your patch strategy for that is. And you use classic patch management, etc. Deal with that. Hopefully get that found and fixed before anybody exploits it, and then move on to the next issue. And kind of change the tone. Be more proactive as opposed to reactive. Don't fix something because somebody got in and you examine the logs and said, oh, they got in for X, Y, Z. Exactly.
So like in the case of something like Heartbleed, when it wasn't an vulnerability, it existed for a long time, are there any kinds of heuristics? Like would you have been like, well, this is really old, you shouldn't use it? Or
That's one of the things that we say in our best practices, which is saying, if you are very far behind the head of the tree.
Even if nobody knows.
There's potentially something going on. There is a benefit of upgrading. There's also a detriment to upgrading. One thing that was interesting about, from my understanding of Heartbleed, is that was a new feature that was added.
Right. If you had like 3 versions ago, it would have been totally fine.
Exactly. And that may be a bit of an anomaly, that the new feature caused the problem. But at the same time, new code that hasn't been banged on is probably more likely to have vulnerabilities than something that's been there for 5 or 10 years. So it is this kind of double-edged sword. Do we upgrade because we want to stay at the head of the tree, things are just getting fixed by the nature of being fixed even without a CVE or a known vulnerability?
But there's a risk of changing.
There's a risk of changing, the risk of new code, things like that. My personal opinion is you should be upgrading as much as you can, just because the assumption is that people are getting exploits and they're not telling the world.
Right. So all the things being equal, new is probably better. So in something like OpenSSL, the actual team, like the group of committers, was really, really small. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's one of the kinds of problems with open source. The idea is that more brains are better, you're going to notice more errors. But then for this very specific component, a few smart people happen to miss something and no one else is looking at it.
Yes.
There's some sort of like community level thing that needs to be addressed?
I think so. I think the thing that was embarrassing to our industry was that, as my understanding is, OpenSSL can only receive something like $6,000 in donations the year before Heartbleed, which is embarrassing. This is a product that basically runs the financial system, runs the security system for the entire world. And that's been changed since. I think they've received a lot more donations and money and material support ever since then. But that's one product, one organization.
Right.
I think one of the important things one of the reasons to do, figure out what open source you're using, is to say, who should we be supporting? Who should we be throwing $500, $1,000, maybe an engineer's hour here or there to try to help with that? Let's look at it. Let's maybe run some classic static analysis tools on it. Let's try to do some pen testing. Let's do a code review. Let's buy them some coffee. One of the things I say in my talks is if your coffee or beer budget is larger than the material support that you're giving the open source world, there's probably something wrong with what's going on at your company. And I think that's true. I think most companies are spending more on granola bars than they are on supporting open source.
For us. Yeah, exactly. Because we're like, well, those guys handled it, but the community's got it.
Yeah. And I think that's going to change. But the first thing is figuring out what you're depending on. What actually saved you money? You went to the open source world to save you money, get better components, things like that. Let's go look at that. Maybe go look at your top 3, top 5 libraries.
And then maybe contribute to that. Maybe do some analysis.
Have you supported the Apache Software Foundation? Have you supported Linux? Have you supported OpenSSL?
Again, it may not be your particular technical expertise. Like you're a Java shop, you're not going to touch C or C++ most of the time.
Right.
So you sort of like let those magical people do their low-level stuff.
And then send them $50.
Yeah.
Send them $10. I think they would appreciate that. Just send them a letter. I mean, I'm using your product. I see so many open source developers just get discouraged. They get nothing but bug reports, and they never get a thank you so much for this. They never get a T-shirt. I think they'd probably rather want money and credit, but at the same time, credit. Thank you so much for this. I think that would go a long way.
Cool. Okay. Any other things that you'd like to suggest or to let our audience know about?
I think the biggest thing is have a conversation about open source with your company. I call it the conference room effect. Go sit around and say, let's talk about our use of open source. Let's figure out what our policies should be. If we need to watch a webinar, read an article, look at a cheat sheet, let's start with that. Let's ask some pointed questions. The classic thing is I say, are you using any open source? No. Well, what's your database? Oh, we're using MySQL. Well, there's a disconnect between the first question and the second question. So ask some pointed questions. What are we using for encryption? What are we using for our database? Are we shipping an operating system? Are we shipping, we're using jQuery? What are we using for our web tier? These are some good questions to start the conversation about open source, even without using Palamida, without doing any sort of deep searching. Start that conversation. You're going to be very surprised, I think, by what you get.
So don't ask, are you using open source? Just ask, what are you using for X, Y, and Z?
Exactly.
And chances are it's something you understand about.
The folklore thing I talked about before. People don't always know what open source means. They think it means GPL, or they think it means Linux.
Right?
Exactly. So ask about technologies. Ask explicitly about open source libraries. Are we using OpenSSL? Are we using jQuery? Are we using MySQL? And then take it from there. Start doing monthly sessions about open source. Maybe make an open source review board whose job it is to find the open source, be the internal experts. Because somebody who just deals with one library a year probably is not going to have the time or the energy to become an expert. But find someone in your company who you can make sure understands the licenses, understands the community, maybe is the point person for security issues that come in, like Heartbleed, etc.
All right. Where should we go to check out more information?
Palamida.com is the best place to take a look. We have webinars every month. We have our website. We have a nice cheat sheet for people who are interested.
And a little printed one?
Little printed one talks about basic licenses and a release checklist. So if you're releasing open source, what should you do?
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.